This morning I'm joined by three esteemed panellists who are going to help me and viewers understand a lot more about the legal sector and its services becoming more accessible. So I'm joined this morning by Rachael Wallace. Good morning, Rachael.
Morning.
Good morning. Rachael, a PhD researcher and tutor at Dundee University, and is currently undertaking an equality, diversity and inclusion study with a particular focus on the legal sector, and we're looking forward to hearing more about that. I'm also joined by Lois Ratcliffe. Lois, good morning, how are you?
I'm good, thank you. Good morning.
Thank you. Lois is a programme manager at Inclusion Scotland. And I'm also joined by Elizabeth Rose, who is a specialist medical negligence solicitor. Elizabeth, how are you?
I'm good. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, no, thank you. So Elizabeth recently launched L&M MediLaw, which is a medical negligence specialist practice, which has got a very firm focus on accessibility. And she has been assisted by Lois in relation to that whole offering. So before we started this recording, we had a brief discussion as to how I would best describe what everyone was bringing to the table, so to speak. And Lois, I have to say, absolutely nailed it. And I did seek her permission and ask if she would just repeat what she had said, because we've got different skill sets being brought to the table. So Lois, if I could ask you to indulge me, could you just run through that again, please?
Of course I can. Thanks, Ali. So I guess to begin, my name's Lois. I'm the Internship Programme Manager at Inclusion Scotland. And it's important to note that Inclusion Scotland is a disabled people's organisation. So we are run by disabled people for disabled people. Our board's made up of disabled people and our staff team's made up of 85% disabled people. And another important thing about our practice is we apply the social model of disability. So we say that people have impairments and conditions, and what disables people is the actions that society takes in relation to individuals. And I'm really excited to be here because I think the beauty of this panel and this discussion is we have three elements coming into play. We've got Rachael with the underpinning theoretical knowledge base for accessibility and inclusion. We've got Elizabeth, who's got the practical application of having to put into practice accessible and inclusive practices in what can potentially have been not quite as an inclusive sector before or currently could improve. And then you've got myself, who I kind of cut across practice, policy and theoretical underpinning. So I'm really excited to be here because I think these kind of discussions, you can get right to the nub of things and challenge some pre-understood norms and get a willingness to change moving forward. That's why I'm excited to be here. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, thank you so much, Lois, and thank you for giving that overview as well. And thank you all for taking the time to join me this morning. So I thought as a starting point, we could maybe just look at statistics around disability in the workplace generally, and then perhaps also specifically in the legal sector, which I know you've been looking at, Rachael. So I think I'm unaware, I have to be honest and say, as to what the extent of disability in the workplace generally is, and in particular the legal profession. Rachael, would you like to provide some information there if you're able to? Thanks.
With focus, because my PhD is on the legal profession, I did look generally at the overall employment situation for disabled people generally in my lit review, but my speciality is looking at the legal sector, and in the most recent equality figures from the Law Society of Scotland was that 4.8% of solicitors who are members of the Law Society have disclosed that they have a disability or chronic health condition, and that it could be as much as 8% because some people prefer not to say, but it's a real focus on that 4.8% because that's how many did disclose. The 8% is just surmising a little bit, to be honest. So yeah, 4.8%, which is relatively low for a large legal profession. I'm looking at ways of widening access to the law profession and looking how, when someone gets into the law profession, how they're supported in the workplace by reasonable adjustments.
Yeah, brilliant, thanks.
Yep.
Well, it actually strikes me as still quite a significant number, I have to say, even at that low level of 4.8%. It's still quite a lot, and I'm sure the true figures are, in fact, significantly higher. Lois, perhaps, do you in other sectors, do you know what the figures are considered to be?
Yeah, so I can give you some figures. So if we look at the general population in Scotland, 20% of the general population in Scotland are disabled, and that's from the Office for National Statistics. It's easy for me to say, and it was 15% of the global population, but they've now estimated it to be 20% of the global population. What we have currently in the UK is a disability employment gap. So in the most recent figures, so I've actually pulled them up just now from my training and presentations that I do, because I'm not very good at retaining numbers, but in the 2018 figures was that 45.6% of disabled people were in employment and 81.1% of non-disabled people were in employment. So that represents a gap of 35.5 percentage points. And that's what the Scottish Government have committed to half, that gap. So we know that it differs from sector to sector, but we also know that we don't have any real core stats on the number of disabled people in employment because of the stigma attached to disability. And because of, nobody gets diagnosed as disabled. Nobody gets a certificate of being disabled. So lots of people will have impairments or conditions that under the Equality Act, as Rachel rightly pointed out, they could define as disabled. But the mainstream media narratives historically is main put an image of charity and pity or inspiration. So as a disabled person, as a person with impairment or condition, if you don't feel like you fall into an image of pity or a Paralympic athlete image, which fantastic Paralympic athletes, but as a non-disabled person, I have so many images that I can happily identify with. But in a way, the mainstream media have let down disabled people in the movement because it's focused entirely on those two aspects. So the situation in employment will likely be that employers have many more disabled people working for them than they know. And in fact, we know another stat is that I think it's just over 400,000 people a year in the UK leave work due to an impairment-related reason. So employers are losing knowledge, skill and talent at a fast rate, and they could retain that. And they're also actively excluding knowledge, skill and talent because there's talent pools of disabled people that they're not tapping into.
Yeah, again, they're quite staggering figures, actually, aren't they? And it shows you the scale of the challenge, but also the opportunity. And so, so thank you, Lois, for that. If we come to the legal sector specifically, if that's okay, because our audience are obviously very interested in that, we're looking at two elements. One is, what can employers in the legal sector do to improve accessibility to disabled solicitors and trainees and legal support staff? And also, what kind of barriers do disabled solicitors face, and how can we assist in removing them? Elizabeth, do you have thoughts in relation to that, please?
Yes, I think probably the main barrier is attitude, because I think lawyers in particular are very competitive and also don't want to show anything that could be possibly perceived as a weakness in case that's possibly exploited at a later date. It's a very hierarchical structure, a law firm, with partners, senior partners at the top, equity, then salaried, and then we go down to senior associates, assistants, trainees, and then legal support staff. And within that structure, you are obviously competing with one another potentially for promotion. And if you were to disclose something that could potentially be viewed as a vulnerability or a weakness, then there's that fear that it's going to be exploited, that fear that people are going to think less of you. And I certainly think there is a lot of people in the legal practice that are frightened to come forward and disclose a disability, particularly with conditions like colitis, Crohn's, which are fairly common medical conditions. My speciality is medical negligence, so I'm reviewing medical records every single day. And in the general population, these are fairly common conditions that I'm seeing. Anxiety, mental health problems are fairly common as well. So it's evident that it exists, but no one wants to discuss that. And I don't know if people feel embarrassed, or they find it difficult to talk to a partner about something like that. And bear in mind, some of these staff are younger, the partner may be a lot older, may come from a different background, and it may be relatively intimidating to disclose that. So I think a lot of the issue is culture and attitude. I am seeing a slow shift and people becoming more open. I think the pandemic has helped that, because I think a lot of traditional conservative lawyers were very much into everybody has to be sat at their desk and visible. They want to see you working. Micromanagement was very much a thing, and then they had to relinquish control and allow workers to work at their own pace and around their own commitments, because obviously there was a time where children were being homeschooled and people's family lives were being blurred with their professional lives. And what a lot of law firms saw was that productivity in many respects were still good. So the argument there is that flexible working does work, even in court work, even in litigation, which is what I do. So it can work. And I think that has, particularly with the older generation in law, I think that has been a wake-up call. So people are more open to have conversations. So I think there is some positivity there, but there's still lots and lots of work to do.
Yeah, absolutely. No, thank you for that. Rachel, has your study thrown up a lot of insight in relation to what's going on in the profession currently?
Certainly my study, but also I have lived experience of being disabled. I have cerebral palsy and use a wheelchair, so I have first-hand experience of trying to access the profession as well. So my study, when I was talking to the participants, it's very much concurs with what good with names.
Yeah, Elizabeth, yeah.
Elizabeth said. It's very much put up and shut up, and it's very much you don't want to disclose your disability because it is perceived as a weakness. Most legal employers have the mindset. There are good employers out there, and there was examples of good practice, I must say. But most employers say that they look at the commercial aspect, and they look at disability and say, you're going to cost me money because you need reasonable adjustments, or you're going to cost me money because you're going to be ill with your health condition and stuff like that. A lot of disabled graduates and solicitors do not disclose because they don't want to be judged on their disability either. They want to be judged on their talents. And a lot of the solicitors and graduates were saying there is not a forum where they can talk about disability. With the bigger firms, there are forums. They have groups of disabled lawyers or LBGT lawyers, and they have like working groups. But in smaller law firms, there isn't that opportunity. So it's and if you're in a very commercial law firm, it is very much put up and shut up, because I know a lawyer in my study had a stroke, and she was expected to work from her hospital bed even though she had a stroke, because her senior partner wanted results and wanted to close a commercial deal. So there is that old-fashioned way of looking at the law profession that's still very much there. With the examples of good practice, though, there are law firms that will use a contextual recruitment, and that helps them get in more disabled people, because they're looking at the context of their skills, their grades, they're looking at what they can bring to the business. So that's very much appreciated by graduates and stuff like that. But very much so, they also have a forum where they can speak about their disability or events around disability that makes their employees want to speak up about it, or even be role models for people coming through the profession. So there is good practice out there, but on the whole, it's very much people just don't want to talk about it because it is perceived as a big weakness rather than, oh, look at the talent we've got here. We can really use that in our business, and okay, they need support through reasonable adjustments, but some of that support doesn't have to cost either. It might be the case of raising a desk or having the correct computer program like voice activated software, or making sure your lifts and toilets are accessible. It's not always big structural changes to the workplace, and very much now, because of COVID as well, all of my participants pretty much said that it was easier to work from home, and they found it easier to manage their conditions from home. So they were hoping their employers would keep the agile working in place, and that it wouldn't be like everyone back in the office, because that long hours culture with some participants, especially if they suffered from fatigue, was not possible, whereas they were able to manage how they worked, when they worked, and got results basically from that. The picture is bleak, but there are firms out there that are trying to make it better for disabled people coming through into the profession and supporting their own solicitors who are disabled. And what Lois said about acquiring a disability, most of my participants either had hidden disabilities or had acquired it during the working life. There was a higher percentage of that rather than being born with a disability. It is very much a matter we need to deal with, because anyone can be affected by disability at any time.
Yeah.
So,
thank you, fantastic insight there, Rachel. Thank you so much. Lois, Rachel covered so many aspects there, so I don't always know where to start, but when she describes it as things being bleak in the legal profession, and that might be the case in other sectors too, but at the same time, some positive, some firms, employers getting things right, and maybe things like the pandemic allowing an opportunity in a way where different types of working actually assists in relation to removing some of these barriers. But could you just give me your thoughts, please?
Yeah, if we take a holistic perspective on disability, inclusion and human rights in society, the picture's pretty bleak when we look at austerity, the underfunding of health services, vital services, the reduction of that. And when we see that it's almost nearly 50% of people living in poverty are disabled or have a disabled family member, that whole picture's bleak. But I do think there's a momentum currently that's really positive. And I think that if the loss, that statistic of 4.9%, I think it was, if that was to take a comparative analysis to other sectors, I think you'd see that statistic, this probably sounds more bleak actually, isn't that bad? Which sounds even bleaker. But it's positive. I think what's positive in the legal sector is, I think if you look at in Scotland, the governing body and the person you have fronting the change, you've got an individual, and I'm going to sing his praises, Rob Mars, somebody who's not afraid to challenge and not afraid to be challenged. And that is so important, because one of the things we learned of one of the key drivers of change and getting it right in inclusion, one of the key values that leaders need to have is a willingness to change. And that's the core value. People think it's all these different things, it's willing to change. And so what we know is, so for example, disabled people's organisations had been campaigning for years prior to the pandemic for remote and flexible working as standard. And I'd speak to employers and we'd be told it'll cost too much money, it'll take too much time, it'll reduce productivity. You get a pandemic and all of a sudden employers are coming to us going, can you help us? And it didn't cost too much money, it didn't take too much time, it didn't reduce productivity, it was your willingness to change that hampered you. And what we saw was a lot of firms who were further on in their inclusive journey navigated that transition into remote working during a crisis stage than the firms that weren't as far along their inclusive journey. So what I'd say to legal firms in the legal sector and to any employer is, it's the risk that you have when you're not inclusive that's a bigger worry if I was you, because of this momentum. So we know that the millennial workforce are voting with their feet and they're choosing to go and work for companies that can show positive action in their ethical commitments, not just tick boxing, not just a shiny star, not just a self-assessment tool. They want to see positive action. So if you, in what is a really competitive resourcing market, as a legal firm, if you want to be ahead of that and capture the right talent, you have to be showing that you're putting commitment to it. The old ways of doing it aren't going to wash with this young workforce that's coming through. I think some of the other things are reasonable adjustments. We're talking about the cost of reasonable adjustments. Access to work is a government funded scheme that will cover the cost of reasonable adjustments. And the thing that always frustrates me and amazes me, it's completely underutilized. People don't know about it. It's like a lovely little hidden secret. So access to work, if you're a business and you employ somebody who's disabled, you can apply for the funds to make those reasonable adjustments, to do the differences to the buildings, to change, get the rise and fall desks, to get the BSL translator. Access to work's there to cover that cost. Now, where access to work can be problematic, if you're a large FTSE 250 firm and you've got a large profit margin, you're going to be expected to cover some of the costs because it's not going to have a detrimental impact on your business. But if you're a smaller local firm, then actually access to work will cover most of the costs for you. So actually, in a way, access to work's a fantastic scheme. I'm not going to lie and say it works smoothly every time, because like any kind of scheme, it's run by certain protocols and things. But when it does work, it's an amazing lifeline for the business and for the disabled person. And I think as well, we're saying we don't know about how to make reasonable adjustments, and it's similar to the unconscious bias discussion that used to happen. Unconscious bias doesn't wash anymore. We have to say it's bias, but it is what it is. And similar, I think, to reasonable adjustments, I think moving forward, companies are not going to get away with saying, we didn't know what to do or where to go for support. Now's the time to actively seek that so that you're on the right side and you're not at risk, you're not vulnerable to moving with the times, because I think it's coming. So yeah, to counter that, it seems bleak, but I'm really hopeful, but I'm always a cup half full kind of person. So.
Brilliant. That's obviously the best way to be, Lois, to be optimistic, but it does sound as though there is momentum.
The original question was about access to disabled solicitors, how we support them. The point I do want to make here is we have to see the symbiotic relationships between legal firms, police stations, and courts.
Yes.
And your legal firm can be really inclusive of disabled lawyers, but if that disabled lawyer is excluded from doing their job in a police station or in a court, that legal firm's in a really tricky position. So I think we need to tackle police stations, courts, and so the judiciary and the legal firms, because a disabled lawyer who's getting excluded from a courtroom because it can't make the reasonable adjustments, or excluded from the police station because the attitudes are not in the right place, is going to be really hard. So I think there needs to be a kind of coming together. Are you agreeing with that, Rachel?
I just want to come in on that, and I think you're right. A lot of my participants do litigation seats, and what they found was that they had to phone ahead to each regional sheriff court to make sure it was accessible, to make sure the courtroom was accessible, and it was on them to do that. But also it's when they got there and they had to ask permission from the sheriff to have a break for medication, say, or a toilet break, or whatever that may be. And it just seems that you are vulnerable because you have to disclose your disability to the sheriff, and a lot of my participants were embarrassed because of that, because they weren't seen as like a solicitor, like within their own. It was like, oh, they've got to have a break because of medication. And yes, a lot of sheriffs were great about that and let them, but that system just seemed that they had no privacy basically around their disability either. And it's about inflexible systems, I think, as well, that need to become more flexible. And I think dragging it into modern day settings, basically, with court and stuff like that. And certainly you're right with police stations as well, or any type of employment tribunals are on the whole acceptable because of what they deal with. But again, my participants had to phone ahead and make that inquiry. They couldn't just assume that it would be. And it's also attitudes as well. So one of my participants was doing a personal injury seat, and she said, can I go and book a hotel in Aberdeen, because she was down south of Edinburgh, and she was like, I'll stay there overnight and then I'll be good for the morning. And the partner turned around and said, I had to get up at 4 a.m. and travel to wherever he was, like, I had court that day, so I expect my trainees to do the same. And going back to like the millennial sort of workforce, that just doesn't wash with them, and it was very much why can't I do that if I'm going to perform better, because I'm not going to be absolutely shattered when I get to the court. And it was very much, I had to go through rubbish times as a trainee, so you will have to do the same. And that sort of archaic attitude is not acceptable nowadays. So it's about changing that archaic attitude as well as accessibility.
Yeah.
That's so true, because I think this is even just in general, there is this kind of culture where trainees have to be treated very harshly because the partner was trained in that way. So
Yeah.
what you do is you perpetuate so I've had a hard time. So going forward, you're going to have a hard time, and then the person that you train is going to have a hard time too, because that's the only way you learn, because that's the way I learned.
Yeah.
That is very live and still a thing in law, and I don't know if that's the same in other workplaces. I've only ever worked in the legal sector, but your traineeship is very much, you've got 2 years of hell and you've just got to get through it. But what I would say is that fairly recently I've seen a more nurturing attitude. I don't know if that's because it's younger people that are now training them, who
Yes.
are of a generation where they're looking at efficiency and productivity and what is better for the client. If the solicitor is anxious and tired and fatigued, they're not going to best represent their client. And ultimately, we want happy clients makes for good business. So we have to look at the big picture. And I also feel if the clients are happier, the team's happier, and the firm's happier, and you don't have that horrible atmosphere that some firms can have. So I do think that is getting slightly better, and that it is, and I'm not blaming all things on older people, because I've had lovely older partners who've been very gentle and very nurturing as well, but there has been this kind of, you're going to have a very hard time. I think junior doctors get it in the same way with consultants. So I think there is that kind of culture, as you say, so that's true, 100% true.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Thank you, Rachel. So, Lois, again, I'm sure you have insight from across the whole spectrum of different types of professions, industries. Is that this type of pattern there as well?
It's hard for me to say, actually, because I don't know if I can speak in a kind of more general term, like disabled people are, what they tell us, our members tell us, that when it comes to transitions in education, they feel excluded because the education system as on a whole is not very, or can fail at times. I don't think it's fair to say that people are not inclusive on a whole, because that's putting people in a homogenous group, and our members tell us they get sick of that. So for example, the term vulnerable can be really problematic because they put disabled people in a homogenous bucket. As a woman, I get classed as vulnerable if I go out on my own in society if I go out on my own in society during the day as a woman, I'm not classed as vulnerable. If I go out at night time on my own, I'm then classed as vulnerable. Inherently in me, I don't change. What's made me vulnerable, you could say, is toxic masculinity, the objectification of women, all that kind of stuff. But I need that vulnerable status at nighttime. I want it as a woman because I see how women are oppressed in society. Similarly, when we put that terminology on disabled people, it becomes really problematic, because what we saw during the pandemic was that do not resuscitate orders were sent out to swathes of disabled people, whether or not they were more or less at risk of the virus. And what some of our members came and told us was, if I get COVID, I die, because I'm not more or less at risk of the virus, and I'm not more or less at risk of recovery than a non-disabled person. But if I get I've had this do not resuscitate order, and I know that if I'm online for that ventilator, I'm going to put down the ranking of a non-disabled person. So it becomes really problematic, because that's somebody's rights, because we've been classified as vulnerable, and we could all be classified as vulnerable. Any one of us could go through systems, any one of our numerous life circumstances. So we need to get away from the us and them, and we need to change the storytelling that we tell about disability in our workforces. So for example, legal terms is quite a lot about disclosure. We often use the term define. I define as disabled, because disclosure has that kind of negative connotation to it. Similarly, we use the term disabled person. Now, we always say go to the lived experience in the room, what a person prefers. As a disabled people's organisation, we use the term in a political context, because we're saying somebody isn't a person with a disability. They don't come with a disabling feature. They're a person with an impairment or condition. What's disabling somebody is the attitudes and the decisions we're making in society. So we use that terminology to reinforce a story that we're telling throughout. And what our members have told us, and my previous CEO, who's an amazing woman, she sat me down, and she's a wheelchair user, and she explained it to me that when she went into a meeting, before she understood the social model of disability, if they hadn't asked her if she required a reasonable adjustment before she got there, she'd feel the weight of the 10, 15 minutes while they reorganised the room, while they got the chair sorted in a certain space, and she used to feel that weight. When she saw herself as a disabled person, as in somebody who was perfectly capable and able, but was being disabled in that situation, she said the weight came off her shoulders, and she could take up space. She's like, I'm going to take up this space because it's not on me, it's on you. I'm not broken, needing fixed. Society's broken and needs fixed because I'm being excluded. So there's something about how we get this storytelling and this culture change and shift across society. So I would say that young disabled people going through education are not getting the service they require, and their adjustment needs are not being met. And so what I do say to a lot of employers, and this goes for education establishments, people are so worried to get it wrong. The fear of getting it wrong means people don't do anything. And when we look at the kind of law around it, that won't wash. The kind of claiming ignorance won't wash when it comes down to meeting people's needs. And I also think that we have to be proactive in our approach, but we also have to change the storytelling on disability so we can release and tap into the knowledge that we already have. Because I think many businesses are doing really good practice, maybe on a one-to-one, maybe it's just an individual manager who's making reasonable adjustments, and it doesn't translate to the rest of the organisation. And we need to realise and reach our own potential as businesses, and kind of not be afraid to see that we're doing it already. Because sometimes when I go to work with an employer, they'll go, oh, I don't have any disabled people working for me, Lois, and we're just not getting very well, and I'm not willing to put that sticker on that I'm good at inclusion. Can you work with me first? And when I start peeling back the layers, I go, you do have disabled people working for you, you just don't know it. And you've got a really good toolkit over here. And do you actually know this piece of technology you've got here has got really good inbuilt accessibility measures? You're just not realising it. Yeah, so again, it's my half full cup, isn't it? I'm saying that things are only bleak because people are scared to get it wrong, and we need to increase people's confidence, and we need to shine a light on where good practice is happening, and then I think we'll move forward into a better place.
Fantastic, thank you.